Hello, everyone, and welcome to another session at Municon 2021. My name is Nish with Washington State University, and will be moderating for the Stormwater Infiltration at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport session by Tom Atkins. Tom Atkins is a principal engineer of water resources engineer with Aspect Consulting. This session has been pre-recorded. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. Questions will be answered following the presentation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation on stormwater infiltration at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. My name is Tom Atkins. I'm a principal water resources engineer with Aspect Consulting in Seattle. And today I'm going to be talking about infiltration efforts over the past 5 years at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. I'm going to start by talking about the infiltration feasibility assessment that was conducted back in 2016, followed by the infiltration infeasibility assessment that was conducted in 2017. And that'll lead to the late 2018 shallow infiltration field testing that was conducted. And finally, the development of the shallow and deep infiltration standard operating procedures that were finalized during 2019. And then I'll touch on the planned deep infiltration testing that's scheduled for summer of 2021. Before I get going, I'd like to pass on some acknowledgements. Port of Seattle staff, including Sarah Cox, Don Robbins, Josh Fagan, and retired Bob Duffner. They all served as service directive project managers for the port. And for Aspect Consulting, I'd like to acknowledge Emily Crumbaker, who's led all the GIS efforts. Dave McCormack, who has served as a geologic and hydrogeologic technical lead, Andrew Ostreg, Brad Kwasnowski, and Matt Lewis, who all supported some of the field work, and John Knutson and Eric Mineta, who led development of the shallow and deep infiltration SOPs. And finally, Robin Kirschbaum with Robin Kirschbaum Incorporated. Robin supported Aspect in developing the infiltration infeasibility assessment and also preparation of the shallow and deep infiltration SOPs. Before I get going, I just want to give a quick overview of stormwater management at the airport. The airport covers about 1,600 acres, and there's three primary stream systems: Miller Creek, Des Moines Creek, and Walker Creek, that discharge to Puget Sound. Overall, there's 2 collection and conveyance systems. There's the IWS, or an industrial waste system, that covers about 400 acres, and about 1,200 acres is the stormwater drainage system, or STIA. And that includes 11 individual drainage basins, each with its own outfall, and each which has its own flow control and effluent limits covered under the individual NPDES and waste discharge permit that exists for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. That permit has 3 parts. Part 1 is the IWS. Part 2 covers the non-construction stormwater, or the industrial stormwater, and Part 3 covers construction stormwater. There's 2 primary stormwater manuals for the airport. Those are the Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington, an ecology document, and then the Stormwater Management Manual for Port Aviation Division. The Port of Seattle has adopted both of these manuals, and the Port's Aviation Manual essentially provides the guidance on how to use ecology's manuals, considering the unique infrastructure requirements and restrictions at the airport. The third document is the LID, Low Impact Development Guideline, that was developed initially during 2017 to provide guidance and oversight for all LID related activities at the airport. And finally, when you're outside of the individual permit coverage area, you're into the adjacent local jurisdictions, which are either the city of SeaTac, city of Burien, or city of Des Moines. Each of these municipalities is a phase 2 municipality covered in the phase 2 municipal permit, and they have adopted the King County Surface Water Design Manual. And now, why would you even care about infiltration? Well, other than, LID is required by the permit when feasible. In particular, successful infiltration can provide a flow control benefit. And for those of you that are familiar with the airport, there's some large detention ponds, detention vaults that are all there for flow control purposes. So any water that can be infiltrated can assist that flow control effort. And then as shown on the bottom of this screen, infiltration also can be used to support LEED and Salmon Safe certifications. And finally, the airport has some ambitious development and redevelopment projects planned over the next 10 years. This slide gives an idea of some of the near-term projects. In particular, you can see on the east side of the airport, there's a lot of planned activity in the coming 10 years. Now let's move on to the 2016 infiltration feasibility. This slide shows the study area, which included the permit covered area plus a 500-foot buffer on all sides. The approach was to determine the important factors for infiltration feasibility, get the information, create GIS layers of each factor, and then determine the feasibility based on the unique combination of these factors. And then finally, create both shallow and deep infiltration feasibility maps. And in this sense, shallow infiltration is considered surface infiltration, and deep infiltration was considered 10 feet or lower, which would be accomplished using probably either dug or drilled drains. So some of the infiltration feasibility factors included the surface geology, surface slope gradient, proximity to steep slopes and landslide hazard areas, thickness of the permeable unsaturated receptor zone, depth to the receptor zone in the case of deep infiltration. And then for this feasibility study, we used some infeasibility factors such as infiltration is prohibited into the third runway embankment. But as I'll touch on in a few minutes, the infeasibility study that we conducted later on really focused in on numerous FAA requirements and restrictions that are really unique to the airport. So there was a variety of information sources. In particular, I'd like to highlight the 2008 groundwater study. Back several years ago, Aspect conducted a really comprehensive geologic and hydrogeologic study in support of the third runway construction and third runway embankment. That included information from over 2,000 boring logs, and a really comprehensive geologic database was created. And that's really what allowed us to readily conduct this really desktop GIS-based feasibility study using existing data without doing any additional field work. So now I'd like to just touch on a couple of the factors that were used in the feasibility study, starting with the ground surface information. This slide shows the LiDAR ground surface elevation. As you can see, it ranges from about 50 feet up to about a high of 500 feet above mean sea level at the airport. And then for geology and hydrogeology, most of you know that glaciation has really impacted the surface geology in the Puget Sound area. And this is true at the airport. In particular, there's generally a surface or near surface till that is stratigraphically above a advanced outwash receptor unit across much of the airport. And this was identified and highlighted in the 2008 groundwater study, which identified a total of 12 regional hydrostratigraphic units. And this is just a map from that 2008 groundwater study showing surface geology. Here's some of the cross-section, or one of the cross-sections that was developed showing those hydrostratigraphic units. And let me touch on a couple examples for some of the factors. This particular one is for the landslide hazard categories. We depicted two different categories, either high to moderate landslide hazard for slopes greater than 40% or within 500 feet of a map landslide steep slope hazard area, and everything else was considered low landslide hazard. And another factor that I've already mentioned was that infiltration of the third runway embankment fill is prohibited. So here's the resulting GIS layer just for the steep slopes and third runway fill category. So from these different factors, together, each unique combination forms of these infiltration feasibility factors defines a hydrogeomorphic unit. And from this, the shallow and deep infiltration hydrogeomorphic units were determined and mapped. So I'll just show you, for example, the criteria for the shallow infiltration hydrogeomorphic units. Good feasibility, generally considered the most favorable ratings with up to 1 moderate rating and a low slope hazard. Whereas the poor feasibility, generally had one or more of the least favorable ratings, or if it had a high to moderate slope hazard, any rating, and it would hit the low feasibility category. Here's the resulting maps shown in, this is for the shallow infiltration feasibility. Red indicates poor infiltration feasibility, yellow moderate, and green is good. And here's the similar map for the deep infiltration feasibility. And as you can see, deep infiltration in general appears more feasible at the airport relative to shallow infiltration. And again, as I've already touched on, that's because a lot of the airport's surface area is covered either with fill or with glacial till at or near surface. Whereas underneath that thin till cap, there's some pretty good looking outwash soils that potentially could support the feasibility of deep infiltration. Now I'd like to talk about the 2017 infiltration infeasibility assessment we conducted. And again, this really takes into account the competing needs for STIA operations, in particular the many standards and requirements that go with the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration. And these are unique to airports. And if you look at chapters 3, 5, and 7 of the Stormwater Management Manual for Western Washington, it describes infeasibility criteria for infiltration. And chapter 5 in particular goes on to state that a local government can map areas that meet specific infeasibility criterion provided they have adequate data basis. And then there's an example of some of the criteria that are memorable to infeasibility mapping. So for the airport, a really important consideration is FAA requirements and proximity to FAA operation zones, the IWS area where infiltration is prohibited, and proximity to airport operations areas. There's also other FAA restrictions, including wildlife hazard management, and as I already mentioned, proximity to the third runway embankment and other structural fills. Some of the other infeasibility criteria include proximity to surface water and wetlands, steep slopes, and proximity to drinking water wells. So here's the comprehensive map showing infiltration infeasibility at the airport, with purple indicating not feasible and brown indicating low feasibility. So again, for shallow infiltration, due to a number of factors, there's pretty limited potential for infiltration. Now, what I want to do is just sidestep for a minute and for the benefit of municipalities, touch on what an infeasibility assessment could look like for a city. This example is for one that prepared for the city of SeaTac, and it's the LID BMP infeasibility assessment. So for the city of SeaTac, we determine LID infeasibility by individual BMP type. And then we develop user-friendly web maps that allow for queries at the parcel level. And these queries will identify areas that are exempt from any field infiltration testing and LID design elements for the areas that, for the particular individual BMP, have been mapped as infeasible. And the approach for this was to use readily existing GIS data sets. So again, this was a desktop exercise, no additional field work was required. And then we incorporated the infeasibility criteria specified in the King County Surface Water Design Manual as amended by the SeaTac addendum. And we created GIS models for each LID BMP and prepared individual infeasibility maps. So there's 10 different maps that are on the City of SeaTac website. 8 are listed here, second to bottom permeable pavement. There's actually 3 different maps depending on the type of materials that are used for fabrication of the permeable pavement. And here's just an example of the applicable infeasibility criteria and data source for a couple of the LID BMPs. And then finally, using the actual web application is shown on this next slide, and I'll just scroll down here. And so this is a link to the feasibility maps on the City of SeaTac website. There's the 10 individual maps. We'll select the bioretention BMP, and that'll pop up a map of the entire city of SeaTac area. And then if we zero in on a particular area or a particular parcel number, we can see for this particular application what's been mapped as infeasible for bioretention. Now I'd like to move on to the 2018 shallow infiltration field testing that was done at the airport. I should mention that back in 2017, Aspects Andrew Ostrecht and myself presented the methods for determining, for the field work for determining infiltration field rates. And this is the detail that was followed for the infiltration test, shallow infiltration testing at the airport in 2018. The reason the initial work focused on shallow instead of deep infiltration testing is that shallow infiltration testing is relatively quick and relatively cheap compared to deep infiltration testing. So based on available information and input from port staff, 6 areas were selected for field testing that occurred in December of 2018. This slide shows the 6 areas that had test pits dug. And then the infiltration testing actually used the small scale pilot infiltration tests that's shown on this slide. And the procedures, this is a slide borrowed from the 2017 Municon presentation, utilize the Western Washington procedures that are shown on this slide. So multiple test pits were dug in each area, small scale pits were conducted, and kind of in a nutshell, the results confirm the shallow infiltration feasibility mapping that had been done 2 years previously. Then in 2019, the shallow and deep infiltration standard operating procedures were developed. These provide detailed guidance for guiding and sequencing for the planning, testing, analysis, and design of shallow or deep infiltration facilities at the airport. And these largely track with the 2019 ecology manual requirements and include the new UIC underground injection control requirements. And so these are very comprehensive SOPs. They include example tasks, schedules, costs, and checklists. And again, they're intended to provide guidance for all future development and redevelopment projects at the airport. I know you can't see this particular slide very well. This is just an example Gantt chart that was developed for deep infiltration. And what I wanted to point out with this is that this isn't a quick turn effort. It's not a 1 or 2 week effort and you're good to go. In the case particularly of deep infiltration, if a mounting analysis is required, the total process from beginning to finalizing design can take 18 to 24 months. So plan that timeline accordingly in your project development. We've developed infiltration review checklists that have 4 broad checklist categories that are shown here for the SOPs. And then each SOP, this is the example, deep infiltration SOP has 8 individual steps, starting with the preliminary step that is a site already mapped as infeasible, leading into later steps which include actual design. And finally, in 2021, we're planning on doing deep infiltration testing. As I've already mentioned, it looks more feasible than shallow infiltration feasibility. And the testing is planned at multiple areas, including the Doug Fox parking lot area. That's shown on this slide. It's kind of east side of the active airport area, in an area that's been previously mapped as looking as good feasibility for deep infiltration. And in the Doug Fox area, from existing borehole logs, we know there's about 35 feet of fill and glacial till at the surface that's underlain by about a 50-foot unsaturated permeable receptor zone. So it'll be that 50-foot zone that we'll look at testing later this summer. This is just an example cross-section showing that deep receptor unit that's highlighted in green here, with the Doug Fox parking area being about right in the center of this cross-section. And finally, for the deep infiltration testing, we've got some steps that we've got to do. We've got to plan and develop a field program, do the actual field testing, which will be borehole infiltration test, followed by data analysis and reporting. And with that, I am ready to open it up to questions and discussions.
All right, questions are starting to come in. Subhash asks, was groundwater table issue an issue for deep infiltration?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends on where you're at in the airport. In some areas, particularly as you get further down, in the flanks of the overall structure of the airport, definitely you have less available unsaturated receptor unit because you get closer to some of the deep aquifer water table levels. So in certain areas, it's not a big issue. In other areas, yes, it would make deep infiltration prohibited.
Another question we got is de-icing treatment a concern for deep infiltration areas?
Definitely, water quality would always be a concern for any infiltration. So there would be requirements that would have to be followed, including pre-treatment prior to any infiltration. And anything that the airport would look at for deep infiltration would really be, more on a regional scale. So it would be water that was already routed through their detention ponds, and then any additional treatment would be added at that time prior to infiltration. So yeah, definitely water quality would be an issue and would be addressed.
Sarah asks, what are your top recommended BMPs / facility types for airfields to reduce wildlife hazard attractant, but still get good treatment?
Yeah, at the airport, there's some large, detention ponds that are, visible, particularly when you're coming and going from the airport. And the port has, had to work with those for many years to lessen the wildlife attraction. And so some of them you may have seen before, they're filled with like floating balls. Some of them have these pretty intense net structures on them. Others just simply, they don't allow it to happen. They build large detention vaults that are underground. So there's been definitely wildlife attractants is a big issue out there. They have other ongoing programs to help with this, but open water is a big concern at the port.
Awesome, thank you. What is the below ground surface distance for deep infiltration you considered?
Yeah, at the start of my presentation, I'd mentioned that we've just chosen the, shallow infiltration would be surface infiltration. Deep infiltration we'd consider 10 feet or deeper. And that'd be accomplished probably with drilled drains.
Awesome. Currently, is any stormwater from the airport infiltrated?
Yeah, there's been a couple small projects. I think one of them was the cell phone parking lot, which our aspect wasn't involved with. That was several years ago. I believe that has some limited shallow infiltration and a couple other, similar small projects, but nothing large scale.
And then has there been any attempt to determine the cost benefits of infiltration due to reduced storage volume?
Yeah, the benefits for infiltration will have to be balanced with, no matter what, if there's new development or redevelopment, flow control needs come up. And that flow control either has to be accomplished at the particular redevelopment site, or through one of the, I call them regional detention ponds or detention vaults. So that's something that the port has to actively track and account for all their development. And I think the cost benefit determination will come out based on the results of deep infiltration testing. And that'll give a better handle on how much water can you really put away, and what's it going to cost to do that, and what does that buy you as far as reduced, pond or vault storage that's needed in the future. So we can't answer that yet, but hopefully we can in the future and see if it makes sense or not economically.
Awesome. Are there any special methods considered for long-term monitoring of deep infiltration areas?
Oh, definitely. Long-term monitoring would be part of it. Depending on where you're doing it and the size of the infiltration facility, there would be, upfront monitoring to validate and verify the groundwater table and seasonal high groundwater. And then definitely long-term monitoring would be required to track the ongoing infiltration and the results of the infiltration. So there isn't any, I mean, there is groundwater monitoring going on at the airport for other purposes currently, but nothing is currently going on with regards to deep infiltration because it's still kind of in the planning stage, and it's to be determined whether or not it goes forward based on testing.
Awesome. And the last question is, what type of maintenance, if any, would be needed for deep infiltration?
Yeah, there'd definitely be maintenance. You know, you need to maintain all of the infrastructure that's leading up to the deep infiltration, including any type of treatment or basic treatment that was put in. And then certainly there would be maintenance required. Sometimes with well bores, problems can arise such as plugging or biofouling, and so those certainly could be ongoing maintenance needs in the long term for deep infiltration.
Awesome. I don't think we have any more questions coming in through the chat just yet, and we are approaching the end of our session time. We've got about 1.5 minutes left. If anybody has any more questions for Tom, you can go ahead and find his contact information through the conference materials online, through FeedLoop and the Municon website. And I think with that, we can call it a session. Thank you so much for being here today, Tom.
All right. Thank you, Nish.
And I hope everyone has a great rest of Municon. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.